So, our next speaker is actually a Victim's Voice advisor. She's our law enforcement advisor. I met her at a symposium for gender-based violence. And after speaking with her, I fell in love. She's such a powerful woman. And I thought, wow, so much power and authority and in control. And then to learn her story of being a survivor as well just made me, adore her even more. She's been really instrumental in helping us make sure that everything we do has a viewpoint from law enforcement as well. And so without further ado, I'd love to introduce you to Lieutenant and soon to be Dr. Heather Gloglich. All right, Heather.
Hi, everybody. I have to be honest, I was a little bit more prepared to speak prior to listening to Bill because my stomach I'm a little sick to my stomach at the moment. And in a good way, right? I feel like all of us should have that feeling because that means that we're human. So let me try to gather myself a little bit. Let me introduce myself. Yes, I am a police lieutenant in Morris County, New Jersey. I feel very blessed to be the law enforcement advisor for Victim's Voice. I have been a police officer for 18 years, and I'm also domestic violence liaison for my agency. I am also a 12-year survivor of domestic violence. And the one thing that I want to point out, and I was going to bring it up towards the end because I wrote notes as I was listening to Bill, but all of his warning signs that he listed were things that I went through. And I think that's kind of what hit me the most as I'm sitting here listening, because I can remember back to me finally calling 911 and getting help. And I never really considered what my parents went through during that time with me being isolated from them and our relationship changing. And so before I move further in my presentation, I just want to say, Bill, thank you so much from a survivor's standpoint, because you are empowering so many people to step up and do the right thing for their children. Because I think my parents' biggest regret is not stepping forward and really saying, this is not benefiting you, this is not healthy for you, we love you and we'll support you in any decisions you need to make. But because of the fact that they never went through it and they didn't know the warning signs. And, I still kind of feel ignorant about the fact that I went through what I went through because I did know the warning signs, right? Because that's my job as a cop. So Bill, thank you. And I can't wait to connect with you later. You're incredible and your strength is empowering. Anyway, of course, I want to say thank you to Sherry. I think this is incredible. I am so excited to be a part of this. What whole entire conference is just already inspired me to do more. I am going to talk to you today about what it's like for people to call and ask for help from the police department, which is usually the scariest phone call anybody will make. And so I want to walk you step by step through what the process would be if somebody called the police and what it's going to be like, because most of the time people are calling the police department and asking for a police officer's help when they need help. And it's never just, hey, we are really thankful for you today and have a great day. We constantly remind our officers that when someone calls for police help, it's because that is the most important thing going on in their world right then. It could be a neighbor dispute, it could be a motor vehicle crash, it could be a domestic violence incident. And we train our officers to push beyond what we're being told and try to see what we can behind the words and look at actions. So what happens when you call 911 or you walk into police headquarters and you are a victim of domestic violence? And when we talk about domestic violence, we're talking about, not just physical acts of violence, but also the harassment, the controlling, things like criminal mischief, the gaslighting, all the things that Bill already mentioned. There's a lot harder things to prove, such as stalking, the hardest crime for us to prove, because most of the time people don't know they're being stalked. And it's very hard to prove as well for them being there. But when people walk in, or we go to a house, we have to start out with an investigation. And really it comes down to us determining whether or not it's a domestic violence incident. People in relationships are allowed to argue. They're allowed to have family disturbances. They're allowed to yell at each other. And that doesn't make it a domestic violence incident. And we will get called for those things. And it's very borderline on whether or not we are going to classify it as a domestic violence incident or whether or not we're going to have it classified as a family disturbance. I tend to think that my agency goes above and beyond and does a phenomenal job of understanding what is what. We train on this a lot. It's the highest amount of volume call that we get, right? When anybody ever asks any police officer, what kind of calls are you going to the most? It's never shootings. It's never motor vehicle crashes. It's never, false 911s. It's always domestic violence calls. That was changed during COVID, which was scary for officers because if we were responding, it was usually incredibly serious. It was never anything such as harassment or criminal mischief. It was more of I need life-saving measures to help me right now because people were trapped with their abusers. So when we walk into an investigation or somebody comes to us and they're in a domestic violence relationship, we have to determine a couple things. We have to determine, one, whether it's a domestic violence incident to begin with, and two, whether or not a mandatory arrest has to happen. In New Jersey, there are 4 times where a mandatory arrest has to happen for police officers. And this is out of the control of the victim. The victim has absolutely no say on whether or not a police officer is going to charge the offender or whether we are not going to charge the offender. It is completely up to law enforcement, except we are guided by Attorney General guidelines, state statute, our own standard operating procedures, so many things where really we have no say when it comes to these 4 things. Those 4 things are if there's a sign of injury or a complaint of pain. And we say complaint of pain because you can't always see injuries. For instance, if we go to a house and a female is pregnant and a male had kicked her in the stomach and she's cramping, we're not going to be able to probably immediately see that there is bruising or she may or may not have a miscarriage or something along those lines. So we have to take the word of the victim that they are in pain. And that is why that was changed in New Jersey, which I think is phenomenal. Because like I said, even bruises, some people don't show right away. We will bring victims back in a couple of days later and take photographs of bruises that may have appeared afterwards. That can also be tricky because someone can say, they are in pain and they're really not, right? So we really have to determine based off of the totality of the circumstances what has happened. But we have zero discretion when someone says that they were in a domestic violence incident and there is either a complaint of pain or a visible sign of injury. And a visible sign of injury can be as little as, a cut on a fingernail. So most people, will be like, a cut on a fingernail, they got their hand slammed in a door, which wasn't on purpose. Somebody was trying to leave, but it still can be a domestic violence incident and an arrestable offense. The next one is going to be a violation of a TRO. So we're talking about mandatory arrests, right? TRO is a temporary restraining order. An FRO is a final restraining order. And if there is one of those that are in effect and has not been dismissed, we have a mandatory obligation to arrest the offender. That is even if a victim asked the offender to come over, which we do see a lot, right? Especially in relationships where there are shared children. We will see, them try to work it out on their own and not be able to get to court to dismiss it. However, if there's a restraining order in place, and a domestic violence incident occurs, that is a mandatory arrest for a violation of a restraining order. On top of that is what we call a no contact order, which I will get into, but that is in there as well. That is not something that is applied for by the victim, though. That's put in place at the request of either a police officer, a municipal, or a county prosecutor or detective or a judge. And then it's attached to someone's charges. The other mandatory arrest on a defendant in a domestic violence incident is going to be if there was a use of weapons in the incident or if there was a threat to use weapons. This was one of the areas that I was really happy to help out VictimsVoice because not everybody understands that when somebody threatens with a weapon, that is going to be something we're going to ask. Usually in the immediacy of someone calling 911, they're very concerned with just being safe. and they're not thinking about all the other aspects that we need for our investigation in order to make sure that we do it complete, and to make sure that the victim continues to get help and resources, and to make sure that they're safe. So that's a huge question that we didn't always ever ask because we didn't want to assume, but now it's become part of our routine in asking that questions, especially if there is an assault that took place. And then the other is if there's a warrant. So that could just be like, we go to an incident and it's a simple assault, and even if there's no sign of injury, no complaint of pain, which means it may not be mandatory arrest. If somebody has a warrant, specifically the defendant, because we try not to arrest victims on warrants during the incident and give them the opportunity to kind of rectify what's going on, the defendant will be arrested based on the warrant. So those are the four times that we have mandatory arrests. It becomes a little harder to investigate when those four things aren't present. However, we do have the discretion to arrest people on things like just simple harassment or criminal mischief, right? If we are at a home numerous times and we're continuing to see a cycle of abuse either evolve or continue, and the victim isn't taking the steps to be free from the abuser, and it's a hard situation for them to get out of, we will charge on things that are not mandatory. I'm talking about harassment. I'm talking about criminal mischief. So say they throw a cell phone or they throw something of the victims against the wall and break it. We don't have to arrest on that, but we will if we feel that it'll help keep a victim safe. Again, it's six does one, half does the other with that, right? Because are we helping the victims? Are we empowering them to try and get free? Are we holding people accountable? Or sometimes we deterring people from calling 911 for the less serious offenses of harassment and maybe threats and criminal mischief, and then they wait to call us when it's really bad. So for law enforcement, it can be a balancing act in regards to trying to make sure that a victim is safe and also holding people accountable for their actions. As far as charges, I mentioned a no contact order. When we're talking about a no contact order, this isn't something that generally a lot of people understand. And when we used to have bail, it was a little bit more efficient of a process to add a no contact order. And basically what that is the exact same thing as a restraining order, except the victim cannot drop the no contact order. That is only at the discretion of a judge. And I have used that, and so has my agency, for victims who did not want to go through the process of a restraining order. I'm not going to get into too much of a restraining order because I don't want to take away from anyone else's presentation. But with restraining orders, we find that we offer them to victims, and then after they feel safe or they feel like it's calmed down, or they want to give the person another chance to, try and be better, we find that they drop them. So when we see situations where we feel that a person needs a protective order, we can request the judge to implement a no contact order along with the charges that are being charged against the defendant. And we can only do that when there are charges that are done. However, it's a really great tool for law enforcement and prosecutors to use in order to protect victims, even when they're not willing to be protected. And that will hold people more accountable as well. Some of the things that are going to help in our investigations when somebody calls 911 or comes in to report that they're a victim of domestic violence is being open and honest. And a lot of the times people feel that because I am a female police officer, I'm going to be the best person to sit and interview a female victim. And the reason I reference female victims more than male victims is because of the fact that overwhelmingly the people who report domestic violence are females and their abusers are males. It is not because I believe that all men are abusers. It's not that I believe that there aren't male victims. But when I reference that, that is the majority of what we are dealing with. And when a female victim comes in, I think my guys for a very long time were like, oh, let's let Heather do it because, one, she has the experience as a survivor, so she can relate to them, which I'm always there to help, survivors or victims of domestic violence, deal with it. But it really hit home for me when I had Robin Hughes, who you'll meet as a speaker in a little bit. She said to me that she has people who volunteer, which are called CRTs, and they come out to help victims that are domestic violence victims in our town. And a male came out as a volunteer, and I was a little taken aback. And I was like, "Oh, this is going to be interesting. I don't know how open she's going to be." And I feel as though it is so empowering to see a man sit across from you as a victim, as a female victim, and be told that this is not how you deserve to be treated. So in fact, it's actually more rare now to see in our agency a female take the lead as far as investigating and interviewing a victim of domestic violence, because I want to empower females to know that the men I work with do not tolerate domestic violence at the hands of a man towards a woman or towards anyone. But it does end up being extremely empowering to have a male who is a power and authority figure, that you're dealing with power control at home in your intimate relationship, and for them to turn around and say what you're going through is not right. And usually women are really, when they're victims, they're talking to other women about what they're going through. So to hear it from a man is just, again, hopefully freeing and empowering, and holds the man to accountability. Let me see how much time. All right, so I have about 10 minutes left. So some of the things that we really need to know about past history. And I think that is why I am so supportive of the Victims Voice app. When I went through my domestic violence relationship with my ex-husband, there weren't a lot of incidents, but there were incidents that I never reported. You know, I was the typical victim. I was in fear of what other people would think. I was scared about my financial situation. We had just bought a house. We had 2 kids under 2. He was also a police officer, so I knew he would lose his job if I reported it. And there went a source of income. You know, I felt embarrassed because I was a police officer, and I should have those resources and know what to do, and maybe already know the warning signs, and not have allowed myself to be in that relationship. And I never reported any past incidents. So when it came down in 2008 to me calling 911 and having my ex-husband arrested, as far as the restraining order was concerned, I was able to add in the past incidents that occurred in order to help me get the restraining order. Not that I needed much help with it, because the incident was horrendous. But when it came down to the charges, I had no written history of anything that had occurred. And here's where that became an issue. My ex-husband, ultimately, after the grand jury, was indicted with, or was charged with kidnapping, criminal restraint, possession of a weapon for unlawful purposes, aggravated assault with a possession of a weapon, and terroristic threats, harassment, and then 3 counts of perjury. So he was facing approximately 75 years in jail, in prison. And he ended up taking a plea deal for 6 months and did 2 months and 1 week for what he had done. And one of the reasons is because he was a police officer. He had passed the psych exam. He had been a pillar of the community. No one ever saw any warning signs. And because I had never reported any past incidents of domestic violence. So they felt that because of the fact that he was under the influence when the incident happened, that it was alcohol fueled, and that he had a higher rate of rehabilitation instead of recidivism. Now, with Victims Voice, one of the great things is, and I know Sherry will hopefully get into this and you guys can research it, but it allows for past incidents to not just be hearsay, but also to be admissible in court when it comes down to charging an individual and also sentencing an individual after they've been convicted of a domestic violence offense. For law enforcement, that's huge. One, it is going to allow us to investigate, charge, and help prosecutors maintain credibility and accountability, credibility for the victim and accountability for the defendant, and to hopefully put upon defendants that are domestic violence abusers a sentence that is fitting for the crime that they've committed. I have to say that being in law enforcement gives me a different look, right? I am blessed to have, this is going to sound crazy for me to say, but I'm blessed to have been a victim of domestic violence that survived, to be able to empower other victims, especially in my community, to feel safe, to understand what the entire process is, and to go from start to finish. I've been there. And before I was a survivor of domestic violence, I had no idea what the process was going to be like. I wasn't aware that if I went in for my restraining order, that the first appearance, I would be sitting in a courtroom next to a lot of victims with all the defendants on the other side of the courtroom. And basically the intimidation factor when you walk in there is is crippling. And so for me, I'm able to train my guys to be more sensitive, to be sympathetic, empathetic, however you want to describe how they are, but to go above and beyond for the victims in the town I work and other victims that come into our agency. And hopefully the men and women I work with throughout Morris County that I interact with, to understand that it goes way beyond just that first initial report, that your demeanor and the way that you support victims of domestic violence and explain to them the process, not just after they walk, not just from them walking in the door, but what happens after, will hopefully keep them safe longer. And I think when people understand that the process is not quick and it's not easy, and you're going to relive what happened a couple times minimum in order to get where you need to be, to realize that you are enough and you are getting out of that relationship and living in a life where, you know, you feel safe and happy with yourself, that I feel like they're more empowered. And so talking to them about the whole process, but understanding that they need to be honest with us and tell us everything that happened. This is the most intimate thing that a police officer is going to walk into, minus, you know, helping someone deliver a baby on their couch, or, you know, helping someone get through a loss, someone who passed away. And I have been on the other end of being a police officer, giving the news to parents that their children are dead. It's one of the most horrific things we do. But walking into someone's home when they are at their weakest mentally and physically and emotionally is a huge thing for someone to call for. And it's intimate, and we are in the most intimate of their experiences. Personal relationships are something that people really do try to keep close at heart. You'll see what they put on Instagram and on Facebook and on social media. However, you know, it's always what's behind those posts that we have to be concerned with. And for us to have the ability to walk in and help people is really where I see the professionalism of my agency and law enforcement as a whole across New Jersey. So helping us with things such as, you know, whether or not weapons were involved, whether or not this is the first time, whether or not they've, you know, been violent towards your animals or other animals, whether or not, you know, they're controlling aspects. Those are questions that I know my officers ask that not everybody is trained to do. They will ask the little questions that will help us build a bigger case in order to enable victims to feel safe in their home, in our community, and everywhere else. The one thing that I want to say is that it really is important for victims to empower themselves to know what services are available. Because different officers have different levels of experience and training. I've been an officer for 18 years. I am a survivor for 12 years. And in my agency, prior to me going through what I went through, I don't think that my officers really took the same kind of stock in investigating those relationships. And it's been empowering to see one of my male officers come forward and say that he is in a domestic violence relationship. And I don't know if that would have happened. And my officers step up every day and really push for domestic violence to be limited. With that being said, I'm proud of the Morris Township Police Department right now, because today starts October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And if you saw the pin that Bill was wearing on the lapel of his shirt, all of our officers are wearing them to show support for victims of domestic violence this entire month, which is a game changer. We've seen the pink patches for breast cancer awareness, which is really important. But it was really nice to see that my agency stepped up and said, you know, we are not going to sit idly by and allow people to feel like victims, and we want to help people and make things better. So as far as law enforcement is concerned and how we respond, we do have those 4 times that we have to have a mandatory arrest, but a lot of the time we are just helping people find resources to get out of the non-mandatory arrest situations. And yes, people, the one question I get all the time is, do people abuse these laws in things such as, you know, child custody disputes? And yeah, sometimes they do. And that's very hard for us, because we sit here and we watch, you know, children have to go through things that they wouldn't have to if there was a mutual respect and less power being utilized over each person. But law enforcement is there, to do the investigation, and we do the charges. We take it out of the hands of the victims at all times. In New Jersey, it is never up to the victim to drop charges. It is never up to the victim to press charges. It is never up to the victim to put a no contact order on, or whether we arrest. So it can be a difficult task, but one that I think is rewarding in the fact that, I know we have saved lives in my agency. With that, I know there's a couple minutes left, but that is the end of my presentation as far as law enforcement's role in domestic violence. Again, thank you, Sherry.
That was fantastic. Thank you. I know that there's always that sense of unknowing about what happens. And I know from personal experience that I would rather know a worst case scenario and be able to prepare than not know what's coming, because I'm more apt to stay with what I know, even if it's extremely uncomfortable. So thank you for all that fantastic information. For the rest of you, her leadership is so inspiring. What you've done for your agency, for your students, for your community, for victims and survivors all over, we thank you. We thank you for your service. We thank you for your compassion and your humanity. Thank you. One of the things that you said was very true about not knowing what you're walking into and what that past experience has been. There was a study done, and they found that a victim will go through 10 acts of violence before they make their first phone call to the police. So you're right. You're walking into a lot of history. And so, I think about you all the time, making sure that you're safe.
Thank you.
Never had to worry about that before. Thanks. All right. So we got 2 minutes left. With that time, before we go into the networking hall, we're going to take a couple of little commercial breaks. So thank you, Heather.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
All right.